Hello, all you magical mushrooms out there. Welcome to another episode of A Little Greener, a podcast all about nature conservation and sustainability. My name is Casey. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined by the equally magical Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Hello. I enjoy that, being magical.
How are you today?
I'm okay. It's had the realization, and again, it's later when you all are listening to this, but it's the end of January right now. I'm not ready for that. How are we already done with a month? I can barely remember what year it is.
Yeah.
All right, and we're already a month into it. So I'm feeling just a little bit disoriented, I guess you could say, today.
Fair enough. January flying by, I'm not so mad about. I am mad that it's basically perpetual March here. It's
So
rainy and like cold, but not really like cold in a crisp snow way. It just rains all the time. And I'm ready for like real winter or just like, let's move on. It's like March. The good thing about March is that, April's around the corner and like there's going to be some warm days, but we're just kind of like March and January means there's like 2 more months of March, I guess. We'll find out.
Good luck with that.
Thank
it
you.
was sunny and probably almost 80 degrees here.
Well, that
today.
sounds lovely. That's why we're running down to your part of the country in like a month because we need somewhere nice and sunny before the baby comes. So that's the plan.
That'll be delightful for you all, and I am going to crash your party at some point to say hi. So.
No, perfect. Crash away.
All right, Casey. Do you have anything from last week? Any challenges, anything like that you want to catch up on before we dive in?
Not really. I didn't really have a chance to like practice ethical wildlife photography or anything like that. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it and learned things. But
absolutely, I was just trying to rack my brain. It always happens where during the week I think of something that I'm like, oh, I want to talk about this on the podcast, and then I don't write it down, and now it's gone. So let's go ahead and just jump in to today's topic, which is, would I say fungi? Let's get that out of the way. We're talking about fungus, the plural of which I have always said fungi. What do you say, Casey?
I also say fungi, but when I traveled to Ireland, they have a bay of fungi, which is spelled the same way. And so I was like, Bay of Fungi. And they're like, no, it's fungi. So that always pops in my, like, now that I see it, because you don't encounter that word very often, even though I pronounce it fungi pops into my brain. It's like hey, remember?
Interesting. Yeah, I think fungi is very deeply embedded in me now. So until somebody tells me outright that I'm wrong, I'm gonna keep with fungi, but I think that it's one of those where multiple pronunciations are correct, and perhaps, but I've heard both. So I've heard fungi, obviously, fungi and fungi.
Oh yes, I have also heard that. Yes.
And I feel like those other two, I can't remember which one now, but is what I hear most commonly when actual scientists are talking about it.
Okay, but are those scientists from
they
England?
Might be from other parts of the world, right? Yes. So until I get a definitive answer, you're probably going to hear fungi.
No, I think that's valid. Seeing as I pronounce cacti and not cacti, I think that is
right.
A very valid way to pronounce it. So
excellent. All right, so we're going with fungi tonight. Casey, what comes to mind when you, other than your story that you just shared about the bay
Bay of fungi?
Yes. What comes to mind when you think of fungi?
Mushrooms. Mushrooms come to mind when I think of fungi, like specifically cartoon mushrooms. Like they always have a red
white
top.
And red, yeah.
Yes. And they're like coming back in style in like decor. And so I see them more often now.
Interesting.
Yep.
I didn't know that.
But now that I'm talking about it out loud, I also am now thinking of Toad from Mario.
Yeah.
So that's my other fungi reference, I guess.
Yes, I do love Toad. But I do think of mushrooms. I almost immediately have a negative reaction when I hear fungi. I'm creeped out by mushrooms. I used to have to rake mushrooms out of a yard when I was a zookeeper. There was one of the animal yards mushrooms would pop up all the time, and we would rake them out more just for appearance sake, really, than anything else. But I get a tingle down my spine just thinking about it. I just, the texture. Do you eat mushrooms?
I eat some mushrooms, but I get it. Yeah, I think first there's the association with death since they're decomposers. Like they're always growing on something kind of moist, and like they're important in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. They have that like spongy, fleshy texture that's like not appealing.
Yeah. So even things that are not inherently negative feel negative to me. And then I just immediately think like fungal infection and, like athlete's foot or ringworm or, the mold that gets like in between tile in your shower and all kinds of negative things pop into my brain. Fungi are amazing and important and diverse and much, much more than some of those negative things that they can be associated with. We're going to talk about that. I promise. We're going to get to more of the positive things towards the end of this episode. We'll talk a little bit about fungi in general, but my inspiration for this episode is something that I think everybody is covering right now, but I figure why not join in the fray, is a television show based off a video game called The Last of Us. I am not at all familiar with the video game. I had never heard of this before until the show came out, but boy, do I love a good post-apocalyptic sci-fi thing, and that's kind of what this show is. Casey, you've watched it?
Yes.
I've watched a couple of episodes. I don't know anything about the story to come. So if you are somebody who watches the show, don't worry. We're not going to spoil anything to come with the story because we have no idea. If you haven't watched the show, there might be mild spoilers for the first couple of episodes, but we're not talking about the story. We're talking about the subject, which is the zombie fungus. So we are going to separate fact from fiction, talk about what the real inspiration for this very fictional story is, and a little bit more about what makes fungi so cool. So stick around for that discussion. All right, welcome everybody to a fabulous discussion on fungi. Now, Casey, you said one of the things that first pops into your mind when you hear fungi is mushrooms, right?
Yes.
And I feel like that is probably true for most people. For most people, the word fungus probably equals mushroom in their minds. But a mushroom is actually just one small part of what a fungus is, and not all fungi have mushrooms. So the kingdom or domain, if you prefer, of fungi is very large. There's at least 144,000 named species so far, although of course numbers fluctuate depending on who you ask. Estimates for how many species of fungi there actually are in the millions, and that number of millions ranges very widely depending on who you talk to. But it is very large and diverse. Fungi can range from microscopic single-celled organisms, which is what yeasts are. So yeast is a fungus, to huge macroscopic multicellular organisms. In fact, they say that the largest single organism in the world is a fungus in Oregon that covers an area of about 3.5 square miles. And when you think about that, if you're imagining some giant field covered in mushrooms or something like that, that's not what we're talking about, because most of the fungus is typically going to be underground. Again, that mushroom that we see is just a small part of the organism.
I would like to pause and say I was trying to Google to see if I could find a picture of this. And the first thing that pops up was that it is called the humongous fungus.
Yes.
Which I love. You can't really necessarily see what it looks like, but
right, it's such a good word. And it is one of those things too where they say that this is the largest organism, because in my mind it's hard to believe. Almost, it's amazing to think about what these fungi can actually do. So the mushrooms that we see are just the quote unquote fruit, if we're sort of making this analogous to plants. They're actually called fruiting bodies of the fungus, and they release spores, which are sort of kind of equivalent to seeds that we might talk about in plants. reproduction in fungi is crazy. It can be sexual or asexual, usually dealing with spores.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah.
Am I understanding that mushrooms are not like a sector of fungus, but a like body part of fungus?
Yes.
So it's not like, oh, cats are part of the animal kingdom. It's like some of us have arms, or in this case, some of us have reproductive parts of this particular type.
Yes,
Yeah.
because, because if you think about it with all of the, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, if you go back to the fact that fungi are so diverse in general and some of them are microscopic, well, a microscopic fungi isn't going
Single
to have,
cell, yeah.
But interestingly, some of the microscopic fungi, there I have a little diagram of a bread mold there, Casey. You can see that even though they're microscopic, they're much, much smaller. That microscopic structure is kind of very similar to the mushroom. So yes, we call these things mushrooms. There are lots of different kinds of mushrooms, but it's just, and that's kind of the common term that we use for them. But it is important to know that beneath the surface of what we see from that mushroom, there's a whole other part to the organism. Does that make sense to that?
Yes.
So within the mushroom and kind of coming down from the mushroom are all of these little filaments called hyphae that basically come together and conglomerate underground into what's called a mycelium. And so there's all of this going on below the surface that are other parts of that mushroom.
But next question, and maybe you don't know this. If you like harvest the mushroom, for example, you're not killing the rest of the plant. It's just, or not plant, fungus. You're just taking away part of it.
I don't believe so. I don't believe you would be. You might be removing a spore producing part.
Element. Okay. Yes.
So depending on spore release timing, they're fascinating. There's so much more because I want to focus on one certain type
subset,
of fungus. There will be more to come on fungi. It is just fascinating. And every piece of what we're going to talk about tonight, I feel like is an episode in itself. But that's the gist on fungi in general. Huge range, very diverse, more than meets the eye, a lot going on beneath the surface. We'll come back around at the end to some of the roles and the different things that fungi do in the ecosystem as well. But now I want to kind of jump in to the inspiration for this episode and talk a little bit about The Last of Us and the zombie fungus. So if you are completely unfamiliar with what The Last of Us is, basically the premise is that a fungus has taken over. People have become infected by a strain of fungus that takes over their minds, makes them attack other people, turns you into weird looking creatures, and just continues to spread basically unchecked. Casey, do you remember the opening scene of the first episode where they have the scientists talking?
Yeah, it's like the 1960s. Mm-hmm. There's like two scientists and a talk show host, and like talk show host is a normal sort of like joking, congenial guy. And I know the one scientist that's talking about mushrooms is basically like, this is the scenario in which a fungi could cause a apocalypse. I don't know if he specifically is talking, I forget if he's specifically talking about like a zombie-like apocalypse or just like a wipe out the human race apocalypse.
I think it's that, yeah.
Yeah, but he's basically like very unflinching. He is not reading the audience. Like the talk show host is trying to like make light of it a little bit. And he's like, nope. And then we would just all die because there's nothing you could do about it. And you're like, whoa, bleak. And then they launch into present day.
The other thing that was interesting about that opening scene too that I liked is they paint this picture of a fungus being able to take over people. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of start off talking about the real zombie fungus, and they talk about how there are fungi that can take over the mind of ants, basically. And then so they talk about that idea of it being able to jump to humans, pairing it with climate change. So they talk about how fungi can't survive in the temperature that human bodies are. And they're like, well, but what if something, say the Earth were to get a little bit warmer, causing the fungi to evolve? So they kind of paint this picture of how this might actually be possible. How did you feel, or what did you think after watching that scene?
Well, first I thought it was really well done, because just even the introduction of like, but if the Earth got a little warmer, like we as the audience in 2023 are like, it has gotten warmer. These scientists don't know in the 60s that it has gotten warmer. So I thought that was a really awesome narrative device. But I did know about the zombie fungus prior to The Last of Us. Do you remember when like they first showed video of that in a nature documentary?
I don't remember when it actually happened, but I had certainly seen this video as well, and was aware of it prior to the show too.
Yeah, so I know that that's what the creator of The Last of Us like saw that really kicked off his thought on this, which is a brilliant inspiration, because it is really one of those things that we think of as science fiction and yet is very much real in the insect kingdom versus the mammalian kingdom.
Yeah. So for me, I had kind of a dual reaction to it, where half of me was like, oh man, like that's so good. Like that's so good, because they took two real things and kind of smashed them together to make you feel like, like this could happen. So yeah, I wasn't like shocked by the revelation that zombie fungus exists or anything like that, but I thought that the presentation of it in that sense was good. So there was a part of me that sort of had a gut instinct like, ooh, like that, how disturbing is that? But then like the other part of me, I'm no expert, I'm no pro obviously, but I know enough to know that just that one change of the Earth warming a couple of degrees is not actually enough. Spoiler alert, to like that in and of itself would not be enough to allow this particular fungus to infect us like that, which we'll talk about more too. So the other half of me was like, this is going to really freak some people out. Right. I feel like some people are actually going to be afraid that this is a legitimate concern that we should be fearful of. Maybe not exactly how the show carries it out, but that idea of a zombie fungus being able to infect us might actually be something that people are afraid of after watching this, which is probably exactly what they wanted. But it was a cool open, a cool introduction. Zombie fungus is a real thing, and in fact there are a lot of species of zombie fungi. There are at least 35 known species of Ophiocordyceps, and that is the species in the video from BBC's Planet Earth that has reportedly inspired The Last of Us video game creator to create the game. And so each of those different species of Ophiocordyceps will infect a different species of insect. Quick note, in the show, they talk about the fungus being cordyceps, which is, there are also a lot of different species of cordyceps. My understanding is that cordyceps are parasitic fungi, but they do not take over their host in the same way that the Ophiocordyceps do. But at the time that video came out, that species was referred to as cordyceps. So that's sort of how the name came about in the show. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is the one that was featured in Planet Earth, and it seems to be the species of zombie fungus that has the most information available to it. And honestly, the more that I was able to find about this, the more fascinating it became. If you watch the video, we'll link to that in the show notes, and we can post it on our social media as well if you haven't seen it. Watching it is crazy enough if you really let it sink in. This is a fungus. This is an organism that doesn't have a brain. It's not thinking. It's just existing, that controls another species. And we're still learning how really this works. So there was a study done by Penn State University that really helped to kind of actually visualize the fungus in the ant. And I'm going to read you how they said they did it because it's over my head. But they said they integrated serial block face scanning electron microscopy with automatic image segmentation and analyses that uses deep learning algorithms to distinguish host and parasite tissue in serial stacks of images. So basically, they took a lot of pictures. They used scanning electron microscopy. Yes. And they were able to look at those images and distinguish what the ant tissue from the fungal tissue or fungal cells, and really look at where the fungus was present in the ant's body at a specific point in time in the infection. And so they were able to learn some things from this. So the way this fungus works is a fungal spore will land on an ant, penetrate its way in. Again, there's a lot of cool, interesting steps that we're still learning about right there of how the spore is actually able to penetrate into the insect. And there it will grow and start to spread around the ant. And after a certain length of time, it will start to take over that ant's movements. And that ant will start acting erratically. And instead of just following its little ant colony and getting food and going back to the nest and following what the order of ants are supposed to do, it will start staggering around, wandering aimlessly. And after a certain length of time, it will go up on a leaf. It will bite down on a vein in the leaf, and it will just clamp there and die. And after it dies, the fungal body, remember we talked about mushrooms being the sort of fruiting body, so a little stalk will shoot out of that ant's head, and spores eventually will come out of the end of that stalk and rain down on all of the other ants in the area and find more ants to turn into zombies. It's bonkers. So looking at where the fungus is in the ant's body, they're hoping will help figure out how this fungus is actually doing it and controlling the ant. And what I read in this study, again, if I'm understanding it correctly, actually freaked me out about this a little more, because you would sort of assume, or at least I would, just hearing that it has to be taking over their brain, right?
It does, yeah. I don't really, once you get into the insect world, because they're kind of considered like a macroorganism where they're like, it's an individual ant, but it acts sort of in benefit of the colony versus its individual interests.
Right.
Like how their brain works and communicates and functions is a little over my head.
But it's fascinating too, because ants act like that. That also, like the way the fungus works, I'm going to use the word understands the way that ants works, the way that ants work, because of some things that we'll get into that it does specifically. But when they looked at these images, this study at Penn State, they found that, yes, so there were fungal cells in all three segments of the body. So there were fungal cells in the head, but there were no fungal cells in the brain at all. They found fungal cells in contact around muscle fibers, and in some cases had entered muscle cells. So it seems like rather than controlling the brain, the fungus is controlling the muscles, which is horrifying. Does that mean that the ant knows that it's doing things that it's not supposed to be doing?
Well, I wonder if this has been disproven one way or another, that the ant recognizes that something is terribly wrong and would like to its behavioral response to that is get away from the other ants, because we can't spread it to everybody else, inadvertently spreading the spores.
So that's very interesting. And I don't think so. I guess I can't say with 100% certainty that I know it's not impacting the brain in some way, that because I think that they think that the fungus is secreting something that's interfering with receptors. So perhaps there is it's interfering with the brain in that way and not just the muscle. So what I'm so freaked out about might not actually be true. I'll just put that out there. But what is interesting is because ants will do that. So if the colony of ants perceives a threat, if there's a sick ant, they will remove it from the colony. And so that's the fungus will separate the ants from the colony, because if the ant just went back to the nest, the other ants would throw it out. The other ants, I think maybe even would kill it and throw it out, which would eliminate the problem. Right. And that fungus would not have a chance to reproduce if the other ants just killed it. So instead of doing that, it gets the ant away from the other ants so that it will not be killed. Again, I say that it's perhaps that's anthropomorphizing too much, but the effect of it is that this ant will not be killed, and that this fungus will have a chance to keep growing in its live host until it is ready to reproduce, and that's when it will kill the ant. But also just other crazy things from other studies. There was a study, this I think was from over 10 years ago now, but looking at an ant population in Thailand. The study at Penn State used laboratory ants and samples. But there was a study looking at an ant population in Thailand that seemed to show that this sort of death bite that the ant would do on the leaf typically occurs around noon, and at a given height of about 25 centimeters or something like that. Presumably for maximum exposure to other living things. But I'm just how does this fungus know? Is it responding to light in some way? Is it, it's just unreal to me that this non-thinking organism seems to control these insects in such a specific way. So it was really interesting. And the whole death bite thing that the ants will do on the leaves as well is really fascinating. These studies talk about how there's a lot of muscle atrophy after this bite too, which means that they cannot release. So they bite down and they cannot release their mouth parts because of this muscle atrophy. It just seems like a horrible way to go all the way around. Yeah. But extremely beneficial. Again, this fungus is acting as a parasite. So it is benefiting itself to the harm of its host, these insects. And again, it's not just ants. We're talking about this one that's specific to the ants, but this happens with flies. And I think maybe flies, wasps, cicadas, maybe there was one I can't remember that I was reading about. But this will happen in slightly modified ways with different species of the Ophiocordyceps and different insects as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. I knew that cordyceps was species, one species of Ophiocordyceps targets one species of ant. Not even this can happen to all ants. It has to happen to one type of ant.
Yes, I think so. Although there was some other things that I was reading that seemed to suggest that maybe there was a little wiggle room in very similar species, but yeah, it's pretty specific. And the other ones I guess I would have to check and see if all of the others were Ophiocordyceps or not. But this does happen. Some form of this fungal takeover does happen with some other insect species in other ways too. Some of them are crazy. I want to say it's the cicada that its whole abdomen falls off at one point, and then it's just flying around releasing spores.
No,
it's crazy. No. Fungus, guys. I'm telling you. So doesn't sound fun to me. Extremely fascinating. So much more detail that scientists need to learn, and certainly that I'm curious to read about now after doing some preliminary research here. So that's a real thing. Zombie fungus. Could this happen to humans? No. No is the short and most direct answer, according to everything that I was reading. And again, this is very popular right now with this show coming out, which is very cool. I love that this is bringing some attention to a real natural phenomenon. But actual scientists that study fungi, that's what they say. Like, this is not going to happen. These species are so very specific. Our bodies, the systems in our body are very different and much more complex than in insects. So, and these fungi have been evolving alongside these insects for millions of years. So again, it would take more than just the earth warming and fungi being able to evolve to handle those temperatures to allow them to infect us. However, some other interesting things about fungi that came up in relation to that, there's just like a little nuggets of truth interspersed in the sci-fi, which I think makes for a good sci-fi.
Yes.
You know, as long as you are not going to delude yourself into thinking that it's real. But fungal infections can be tough to treat in people. There's not a large percentage of fungi that cause infections in us, but I mean, I mentioned athlete's foot. There's the ringworm is a fungal infection. You can get fungal infections in your lungs, although it's pretty rare unless you're otherwise immunocompromised. But they can be difficult to treat, especially as compared to, say, like bacterial infections, because fungi are more similar to us. They're a eukaryotic organism, like animals are, which means they have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, whereas bacteria do not. So it can be a little more challenging to come up with medicines that will target the fungus and not us. So again, in the show, in the second episode, they talk to a fungal expert, and they're asking her, like, what is, they're explaining the situation, and they're like, what do we do at like the very start of the outbreak? And she's like, there's nothing, like there's no medicine, you can't do it. Basically we have to destroy everything, which is a very extreme response.
Yes, I did think that moment was slightly far-fetched. Just like they take advice from this one scientist who was like, gotta destroy everything. Mm-hmm. I will say, so I took a class on the apocalypse in college.
No way.
Yeah.
That's the coolest thing I've ever heard.
It was my senior seminar for my English major was a class on the apocalypse. What's up, Dr. Pelletier? He's not listening, but hey. And so we talked a decent amount about zombie apocalypse. This was like very much at the height of The Walking Dead being very popular. We watched 28 Days Later, which my brother-in-law argues is not a zombie movie. I argue it is. And one of the things that we covered in that, and this is going to be like a very boiled down sort of version because I don't remember all of our sources and stuff, but basically zombie apocalypse narratives and zombies have been around for a really long time. And the way that we explain how they happened has changed a little bit based on the anxieties of society.
Interesting.
The first zombie narratives are like magic based. Like it's a kind of necromancy witchcraft situation. And as time progressed, even that narrative got a little bit more racialized as there was some racial anxiety like voodoo and things like that. And so in our modern day, having something like a virus or a fungi much more jives with our society's anxieties about science and things that we perceive as real threats now manifested in the zombie narrative.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah, English majors have we have purpose.
Yes, of course English majors have purpose, but that is so interesting. I'm so jealous that I didn't get to take that class, but also thanks for sharing. I mean, that it makes total sense. And again, I think plays into the whole why that opening scene works so well.
They take another form of our anxiety and all of a sudden say like, oh, that climate change anxiety you have, now that is wrapped in this zombie apocalypse narrative. Like we're moving past the pandemic zombie apocalypse, which was The Walking Dead. We've now experienced pandemic and now we're moving into like a ramifications of climate change, natural world coming back to haunt us sort of situation.
Yeah.
So,
oh, fascinating.
Yeah, a nice new development.
Yeah. And speaking of climate change, that is a real concern as well. Again, not that we're going to turn into zombies because of fungi, but climate change will have an impact on fungi. What that is, again, exactly, there are questions around that to be answered. But we've talked on this podcast before about the prevalence of some diseases increasing due to climate change. And that is a potential for some, I think, species of fungi potentially becoming more easily transmissible with climate change. But there could also be detrimental effects to very beneficial fungi as a result of climate change, which we'll touch on a little bit, but actually there's some that can get really complex too. So we may have to save some of that for another episode as well. I do want to talk about a couple of other quick things that the show might get right or wrong in relation to fungi. One is something that the show, at least the couple episodes that I've seen so far, has ignored so far. And I know that this is different in the video game. The video game does use spores. The show does not show the fungi spreading via spores at all. That is generally how fungi reproduce, whether it's sexually or asexually. But you can kind of see why that would not, you would probably have to suspend reality like a little bit too much.
The argument I've seen is twofold. One, the director's kind of like, if they spread via spores, there wouldn't be a show because we'd just all be dead.
Right.
In the game, I know that a lot of characters have to wear like oxygen masks. And the other argument that I saw is that Pedro Pascal is the main actor in this series, and he is also the Mandalorian, where he has to wear a mask the entire time. And so they were like, why would you pay Pedro Pascal to hide his face again for this series? Why don't we just let him, be his normal acting self? So that's the sort of argument that I've seen. I mean, they said at least for the season 1, so it's possible that they'll have some sort of like evolution. But
yes, they have mentioned spores in one of the episodes. But yes, it makes sense to me to not use that. But I mention it here just because I think it is important to note. Like, we're inhaling fungal spores all the time.
Yes,
all the time. They're everywhere.
Yeah, that reminds me, I've lived in an apartment with mold before. Well, that's no fun.
Sure, yeah. And so that might be one that you would notice, but just general in everyday life, regardless, we're walking around outside, we're inhaling fungal spores. Just most of the time they don't do anything to us.
Sure. I think also maybe as a society, we might be a little like mask fatigued from like,
True
like
story.
we've experienced that airway transmission of something bad. So maybe we're just like,
we don't need that in our sci-fi shows right now.
Yeah,
for sure. So yes, it's a fair omission in my mind. I already mentioned the comment about medicines, where she talks about there not being any medicines. We do have medicines that treat fungal infections, but they can be harder to treat. So I thought that was, again, sort of overblown, but a nugget of truth in there that's kind of fun. And then I thought there was an interesting piece of, they don't call them zombies really in the show. They
call them the infected.
The infected, yeah. And they kind of introduce this idea that the infected are connected via growth underground. They basically talk about hyphae and the mycelium without mentioning either of them by name, but they do bring in this idea that there's a lot of fungus that we don't see that's below the ground. So I kind of liked that they brought that in as well.
Yeah, I mean, that theory is really interesting because it's related to kind of how trees work too. So there's some theories about like how trees use fungi to communicate. So that is a cool like nugget of truth mixed into a not realistic execution of that truth.
Yeah, and hang on to that too, that mention of plants, because we'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, so all those things being said, I think the show does a really nice job. I think it's really exciting to see fungi become popular like this, and to see that the creators do seem at least relatively aware of fungi in the real world. And while they're not interested, obviously, in getting everything exactly right, I think that they've done a really nice job of interweaving those little bits of truth throughout the story. So it's pretty fun. And I think it's important for us with all that to talk about why fungi are so important and why we should care about them. And you mentioned one of the things that I think is really important that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of is the relationship that fungi have with plants. So Casey, as a plant person, how familiar are you with this plant fungus relationship?
A little bit. Because I'm sure it's much more complex than my understanding of
yeah,
it
we're staying basic level.
We're staying basic level. Yeah. Basically, we all know plants put down roots to get nutrients out of the soil. The actual way that most of that happens is that they have a symbiotic relationship with fungi in the soil, mycorrhiza. We call it Mike sometimes. Like they sold a product in garden centers just called Mike because
I love it.
Because it contained mycorrhiza, and they exchange basically like sugars for the different types of nutrients, and it helps them process. And then more recent research has suggested that trees will also use this fungi as a network through the forest to communicate across different trees and as like almost an immune response or things like that to communicate danger, things like those sort of things are somehow related to the fungi.
Yeah, which is something that we definitely want to talk about more in the future. Yes. This is a concept that I was familiar with, but I could not find too much as I was reading, at least in the time frame that I had, that talked about that too much. So definitely more on that kind of communication piece to come in the future. But for now, yes, this mycorrhizae, this symbiotic relationship between the plants and fungi is really important and more prominent, I think, than I realized. Around 90% of all vascular plants have a symbiotic relationship, apparently, with what is called mycorrhizal, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Mycorrhizal, rhizial, whatever.
Mike.
Yeah, fungi. So basically, as you, I didn't touch on this in the beginning, but fungi are not plants. They're more closely related to animals. They are not photosynthetic, so they don't produce their own food. So yes, the little hyphae, the mycelium are kind of in the ground, and they actually will secrete enzymes to sort of externally digest and then absorb nutrients from the soil. But they will actually get sugars from the roots of the plants and then pass on other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus to the plants. And I think the idea is the hyphae of the fungi are smaller, they're finer, they reach further than the tree roots can. And so they help bring in some nutrients that the roots wouldn't otherwise be able to reach, which again, that in and of itself, fascinating. And I love that we start off talking about fungi in this parasitic relationship that they have with insects. And now we see here this kind of beautiful symbiotic relationship where both species is benefiting at the end here. So they're extremely important in their ecosystems. This is just one of the reasons why.
Yeah, I will confess that I haven't read any research papers about this, but in the garden center industry, if you look at some of the different types of fertilizers that are available, you will see this fungi listed as an ingredient in these fertilizers. And the idea behind it is basically that in very developed areas, in our suburbs, in our cities, all of the construction has really killed out a lot of the organic matter of our soil, which compromises things like that fungi. And so when you plant a new tree in the ground, for example, that tree might not have as high a chance of success as it would in natural soils because the mike isn't around as much. So by adding that in the fertilizer, and they'll have like lots of different species of it in the fertilizer, the idea is that it can help build that root system to more effectively take up nutrients. Yeah. So like you're adding nutrients to the soil, but you're actually also adding something that helps them take up the nutrients.
Yeah.
So again, not sure all the research, but that is the idea behind those sort of products. So if you see that, that's what you're seeing.
Yeah. So I think that's just a fascinating thing and shows why we should all be more aware about the fungi around us. Other things, of course, we eat fungi. I don't, but people do. people eat mushrooms, and some mushrooms are very valuable, and people get very obsessed with their mushrooms. But also, baker's yeast, that's a fungus. Brewer's yeast. If you've ever taken penicillin, you can thank fungus for that. You mentioned earlier in the show, Casey, that there's a group of fungi that are decomposers. So that's another extremely important role that these organisms will play in their environment, breaking down nutrients, returning good things to the soil, again, helping out all the other life around it. And even zombie fungi, even though as horrible as it sounds, they play an important role in the ecosystem as well. I would say in the same way that we talk about any sort of predator-prey relationship, there can be some population control with the zombie fungi. And that's the thing I didn't even mention. This is an aside now, going back to what we talked about earlier. There are also parasites on the zombie fungus. Like there are other, which I can't remember now. I think it might actually be another fungus that parasitizes on the zombie fungus. Don't quote me on that 100%, but there is an organism that will parasitize the zombie fungus and keep it from reproducing. Basically, keep that thing that shoots out of the ant's head from releasing spores. So that in turn keeps the zombie fungus from going unchecked. Nature.
Wild.
That's what I'm going to end with. Nature is wild. Fungi are crazy, super cool. There will be more episodes on fungi, but I just wanted to, like I said, just join the party with folks who are finding out about fungi or becoming more invested because of the popularity of the show. And I think it's cool when that happens, whenever we can kind of cross over into pop culture and spread the nature love. I think that's really fun.
Yeah. Shout out to anyone who's in Dr. Pelletier's Apocalypse seminar right now who's probably watching The Last of Us for homework.
Man.
But it's a good show. I mean, if you're into not even just zombie narratives, like it's high quality character development and things like that. So.
I'm not familiar with any of the, I mean, I've heard of The Walking Dead and all of that, but I never got into any of that. I don't have any particular attachment to any zombie type things. But like I said, I love the post-apocalyptic stuff. And yeah, some good characters, a well-done show. Fungi are super cool. Stick around for your challenge of the week. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed in some way that discussion on fungi. Zombie fungus is a creepy thing to think about, but also just very, very cool when you start to think about all of the minutiae of how it works. And so much more to the world of fungi than the zombie fungus. So if that is your starting point, we hope that this episode made you kind of open your eyes to beyond the zombie fungus. We'll talk more about fungi in the future. And your challenge for the week is hopefully going to help broaden your horizons with fungi a little bit more. And it's quite simple. It's just to go find a fungus. And cleaning your bathroom does not count. That is I was not, gonna say, yeah, no.
My goal is not to find it in my fridge. But
yeah, no. Yeah, so that's another good. Yeah, chores. Fungus related to chores does not count.
It doesn't count, but you can still take a picture and tag us in it because it's a fungus. Like it's playing its role.
That's true. Yeah, that is very true. They can also look kind of cool sometimes. But I would say go outside and find a fungus if you can. Obviously, this is going to be maybe dependent on where you are and the current weather and all of that fun stuff. So if you can't actually go out and find a fungus of your own, get on iNaturalist. You can search just fungus. Like you can put that in and it will pull up sightings around you, and they do just look really cool. I didn't even mention lichens tonight, which is a relationship between fungi and algae, and some of those are beautiful. they're gorgeous. I mean, some of the mushrooms that you see are beautiful. So explore some fungus on iNaturalist. And again, you can look at just the sightings around your location as well to see what fungus is around you. But if you can, if you're in a place where the weather allows for you to go outside and walk around and look for a fungus, see what you find, and then you can post it to iNaturalist and have somebody identify your fungus for you.
Yes, and tag us, and also don't eat it unless you really, really know what
please.
it is.
Yeah, true. That's very true. Yes.
Some are yummy, and some are what
dangerous.
Black Forager calls tummy no-nos. So,
she's great.
Yes, Sarah, if they want to tag us, where can they do that?
You can find us on Facebook at A Little Greener Podcast. You can find us on Instagram at A Little Greener Pod. You can find us on Twitter at A Greener Podcast. And you can email us if you would like at a little greener podcast at gmail.com. You can send us your photos and we'll post them for you.
Awesome. Hey guys, we're taking next week off.
Yes, we are.
So you've got 2 weeks to find your fungus or do any other challenges that you want to let us know about. But we're going to talk to you again in a couple weeks, and we hope you have a good, safe next part of winter.
Bye.